Okay, welcome to our Erev Shabbat Parasha edition of our class. Perashat Shelah. How much can fit into one small prayer? It's a question that we have to ask ourselves every single day in terms of how many different aspects of kavanah, focus and concentration, and different angles of that focus and concentration could actually efficiently fit into our thought process as we read the words. Moshe Rabbeinu was the absolute paradigm for that idea in this parasha, and I'm not talking about his famous prayer defending and saving Am Yisrael after the complete debacle of the Het HaMeragelim, the sin of the spies, in which once again he came to their rescue, at least from immediate annihilation. But I'm referring to a prayer that's not really written in the book, so to speak. It's rather a statement that Hachamim teach us. We know that Moshe Rabbeinu was told, Shelah lecha anashim, to send prestigious men, as we will call spies, to go to Eretz Canaan, to what would be Eretz Yisrael, and to stake out the joint, so to speak, and bring us back a full report on what you have observed. We know that much later on, when HaKadosh Baruch, when Moshe Rabbeinu recalls the story in Parashat Va'etchanan, it's not HaKadosh Baruch who commanded the mission of the spies, rather it's Am Yisrael who asked for that mission, requested them to be sent. There's a great discussion about reconciling who it was that initiated the request, Hashem or them. And the end of the day, it was the right thing to do. And Moshe sent those 12 spies. And the Torah lists the names and representatives from each one of the tribes of the Shevatim who would be sent as spies. And one by one, we go down the road to this tribe, this name, this person. And we get to Shevet Ephraim, and it says, the person that's representing Shevet Ephraim is Hoshea bin Nun. And after the list ends, it says something interesting. Vayikra Moshe leHoshea bin Nun Yehoshua. And Moshe Rabbeinu names Hoshea, names him Yehoshua, meaning that he added a letter to his name, which added also a syllable to his name, and changed his name, so to speak, not completely, but you can say it was a name adjustment that Moshe Rabbeinu gave. This is a topic of conversation. It's a major, you can say, a wellspring of commentary in the Torah, in the parasha, as to what was going on, what was Moshe Rabbeinu doing. But there is a Gemara, a well-known Gemara, in Masechet Sotah, that reads into that name change a little bit. And the Gemara says that Moshe Rabbeinu at that point prayed for Yehoshua, and he said as follows: Yah is the name of God, Yud Ke, Yah Hoshiacha me'asat meragelim. God should save you from the plans of the spies. Well, that midrash, that Gemara, should trigger a number of questions. Well, first is the most obvious question regarding the name change. This is not the first that we see of Yehoshua ben Nun in the Torah. The first we see is not in Parashat Shelah, but in Parashat Beshalach at the end, when of course he courageously led Am Yisrael into battle against Amalek. We also saw in Parashat Kitisa by Het HaEgel. He existed, and he does not exist as Hoshea. His name was Yehoshua at the start, right from the beginning. We're talking about a few months in to the stay in the desert. When we're first introduced to him, we know his name as Yehoshua. Here we are a year later in their travels in the desert, and we're told his name is being changed from Hoshea to Yehoshua. We never knew him, never knew him as Hoshea. We only knew him as Yehoshua. So really, when did this renaming take place? That is an obvious question just based on the pshat, on a cursory reading of the Pesukim. Also, you can very easily ask that if Moshe Rabbeinu wanted to pray for him, Moshe knows how to pray. He didn't have to rename this person on whose behalf he was praying in order to make an impact. Just pray for him. You don't have to rename. You don't imagine if you renamed every person that you prayed for. But I think the biggest, the most obvious question on this midrash, in this Gemara, statement of Hazal, Moshe Rabbeinu prayed, God should save you from the sin and the advice and the misguidance of the spies, is that, are you kidding me? Moshe Rabbeinu knew of the tragedy, the impending tragedy and the debacle that was to be, and he didn't open his mouth, and he sent them anyway. It's a very difficult statement. Well, there is a number of approaches. Each one of them will not only solve those questions, but will shed light on the power of, and Moshe Rabbeinu demonstrating the power of a small prayer if it's focused properly. First, let's just preface by saying that there's a few different theories about this renaming. The first theory is that really it occurred in this week's Perashat. His name was Hosea. Moshe renamed him Yoshua. What about the previous mentionings all the way from the book of Shemot and on of the name Yehoshua? Well, some commentaries say he was named what's called Hashem Ha'atid. There, his name was still Hosea. The Torah was calling him Yehoshua based on the name that would be, the new adjusted name that some months down the road he would receive. That is not an uncommon occurrence in the Torah. The other approach is that no, really, the renaming took place earlier. It took place earlier. When exactly did it take place? There's different theories. The Rashbam said perhaps it took place when Yeshua was officially named as his misharet, his sidekick, so to speak, his assistant. Some say, Sfordno says, that really when he became known as a powerful leader, maybe a military leader, perhaps after the war against Amalek, where he led them so courageously, Moshe Rabbeinu saw fit to rename him a title, give him a title that would have a Yeshua and a prayer and you can say a label from the perspective of others that this person should be saved, because he's going to stick his neck out as a strong leader for Am Yisrael. And if that's the case, according to that, where he was already named prior, so then in this parasha, it's pretty much saying that Vayikra Moshe had already called, had already renamed Yeshua ben Nun, Yehoshua. And therefore, maybe, Hachamim are saying he prayed. So right now in this parasha, we're sort of reflecting, you can say, on his current name and how it became. Okay, let's talk about a few different possible approaches to what Moshe, according to Hachamim, was actually praying for. Well, in the first case, very simply put, he was praying for Yehoshua. Why did Yehoshua ben Nun need prayer? He was a great man, a future prophet and leader, the first of the Shoftim and a leader of Am Yisrael. Well, we have to first of all preface by saying Moshe Rabbeinu was not aware of the sin of the spies to come, because that would be a very, very, very difficult accusation against Moshe Rabbeinu. And Chas v'shalom, should we think that he concealed such a terrible, tragic event and allowed it to happen? Well, we have to, off the bat, understand that and believe that. So what was it that he was worried about then for Yeshua ben Nun? Well, it's very possible, and by the way, there is support to the fact that Moshe Rabbeinu did not know what was to come, because there are other versions of that sentence from the Hachamim. Yoshiacha, God should save you. Another version of it is mihador hazeh, from this generation. A more, you can say, vague and general prayer. And indeed, Moshe Rabbeinu saw and his great student, his prodigy, Yehoshua, he saw great things. One of the traits that he saw was that Yehoshua was a man of justice, a man that really was not afraid to speak up when he saw injustice around him. And we see a lot of support for this. By the way, of course, he was from Shevet Ephraim, who's from Yosef. And we know that Yosef, sometimes, even when he was younger, was so interested in justice and speaking out to a fault when he was less mature, right? He couldn't help but speak to his father about the wrongdoings of his brother because it bothered him so much. So you can see this is something that's, so to speak, in the genes. But not long ago, just last week's Perashat, where there were 70 elders which had received a spirit of prophecy from Moshe, and 2 ended up, you can say, extending their communications and prophecy in Yeshua's eyes too long. And Yeshua went up to Moshe Rabbeinu and said, Adoni Moshe, Kilaim, stop them. They're in front of you, they're prophesying. This is not respectful. And of course, Moshe Rabbeinu said, listen, don't be zealous for me. Halevai, if only we should all be prophets. But you saw that Yeshua ben Nun immediately reacted to what he saw as an improper action and spoke out. Here he's sending them on a very volatile mission. And who knows the obstacles to come as they travel through enemy territory and perhaps become intimidated and scared. And who knows, in the face of difficult decisions, what Yehoshua might end up, let's say, speaking out against. And therefore, he was worried. And Moshe Rabbeinu therefore prayed on his wonderful student, and he said, Yah Yoshiacha me'asat meragilim, or mehador hazeh. It was basically a prayer that HaKadosh Baruch Hu should guard you and watch you and keep you. And should you end up finding yourself in a position where a compromised position, and you do your thing, God should keep you, God should watch you. Well, that is a very simple approach where Moshe Rabbeinu prayed for an individual. But there are higher levels and more underlying currents behind Moshe Rabbeinu's prayer. I believe possibly that Moshe, although he did not know about the impending terrible iniquity, the sin of the Het HaMeragelim, of the spies, but Moshe had reason for suspicion. He had reason for concern. It's very possible that he had inside of him some type of preconceived notion that something wrong was about to happen. Maybe he felt so sick inside and did not really relate exactly to why, but it's possible that it felt to Moshe that this generation was not going to be the one to merit entering the land. And in fact, perhaps me, the leader of the people, would not be the leader to usher them in to the land of Israel. Why do I think that? What would be the source of that? Well, first of all, last week's Perashat, where the sin was not quite, didn't rank with Het HaEgel, the sin of the golden calf, and what's to come, the sin of the spies. However, it was the sin of the desirers, which we mentioned last week. And in fact, a year ago, we spoke about, from the perspective of Rabbi Soloveitchik, how in fact, Am Yisrael were a very short few days, the Torah tells us, from entering Eretz Yisrael. And in fact, we were on what he calls the Messianic march, the march towards redemption, and everything was in its right place and about to happen. And it was interrupted because of petty, animalistic desire on behalf of the people. And at that point in time, their momentum was impeded and their path was broken up. And at that point, perhaps the decision was made that they were not going to be the generation, although they hadn't committed the sin of the spies as of yet. But that might have been enough to implant in Moshe Rabbeinu's mind and heart a sick feeling that this wasn't going to happen. And a proof to this is based on the Emek Davar. The Nesiv Alav HaShalom explains that one thing we do know is that there was a need for spies. God commanded, the people requested, it was agreed by all that there was a need to send spies. If there was a need to send spies, explains the Emek Davar, that tells us most definitely that this mission, this impending war within which we were going to embark against the 7 nations, against Canaan, was going to be waged bederech hateva, in more natural means, as opposed to derech nes, as opposed to through some supernatural means. And if that was the case, then Moshe Rabbeinu very much saw at this point that if it was going to occur through natural means, then it was not going to occur immediately. This was going to be a process, that entering the land was going to be a struggle, that it was going to be a bumpy road. And if that's the case, then Moshe Rabbeinu was extremely worried, not just for his student Yehoshua, but for all of Am Yisrael. And he prayed and he said, my student, my son, my dear Rohi, Yehoshua, I feel that maybe not now, but maybe shortly in the coming days or years, that I will not be here with you anymore. I feel that there is difficulty lying ahead in the months and the path that lay before us. And therefore I pray, Yah Yoshiacha Me'asat HaMeragilim, or Mehador Hazeh. I pray for you, my student, that you, who I see as the future leader of Am Yisrael, God should be with you. Alamak. I pray that God will be with you through all the difficulties, whatever they may be, which are very likely and inevitably will befall upon this nation. I feel it. It's in my gut. I know it. And therefore, I pray that you should have success in leading this nation, because I'm very, very concerned. And therefore, within that small line and that renaming, there was a prayer not just for his student as an individual, but for all of Am Yisrael. But I believe there's more. And there's quite a lot more. But one other possible angle, perspective of that little prayer from Moshe Rabbeinu is as follows. Let's go back to the original incident where we are first introduced to Yehoshua ben Nun. Again, that was the war against Amalek, Milchemet Amalek. What was it? What was that message given to Yehoshua through Moshe Rabbeinu in the aftermath of that war? Well, Hashem told Moshe Rabbeinu to speak to Yehoshua. He didn't just say to speak to him. He said, Kitov zot zikaron basefer. Record this war in the good book. V'sim be'oznei Yehoshua. Place it in the ears of Yehoshua. We've seen that term. We saw it elsewhere in the beginning of Perashat Bo, where the plague, the last few plagues, were to be told to your children and their descendants and put in their ears. When the Torah uses that phraseology, it's referring to something that I want you to always hold with you. I want Yehoshua to always be cognizant of the following. And what is that? That line to end that war, that parasha of Shelah, was Kiyad al Kesya Milchama Ladunai Ba'amalek Midor Dor. He, whenever, Yad, a hand, a challenge, al Kes, against the throne of Yah, God, Yud Ke, there will be a constant war of God versus Amalek from generation to generation. What that statement was referring to, and that warning that God was giving Yehoshua through Moshe Rabbeinu, was that the name of God throughout most of Jewish history will be Yah, Yud Ke, not Yud Ke Vav Ke. It'll be a partial name. It'll be an incomplete name. And that's because there'll be evil in this world. And God will not be recognized. And you need to know that as long as that is the case, as long as God's name is not complete, there will be a battle against evil that will never end. And there will always be a challenge against the throne and the incomplete name of God. Tell that to Yeshua. Insert it and plant it in his ears. And never let him forget that when he becomes leader, he leads the fight of good versus evil. And he leads the charge to enlighten not just his nation, but the rest of the world as to the existence of the one and only God. And therefore, with this prayer and this renaming, Moshe Rabbeinu was not only praying for his student, he was not only praying for Am Yisrael, but he was praying for God Almighty, for HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Yah Yoshiacha. He added that Yud. And the Gemara Chachamim so insightfully say, Yah Yud Ke Yoshiacha Me'asat Meragilim. May God, or in the impending days of difficulty and the many thousands of years of exile, the incomplete name of God, Yah Yoshiacha. God should be with you and you should be with God. And you should always remember what you stand for, what the challenge in front of you is, and what the job will be for you and your nation for generations to come. And until we see the Geulah Shirema, all that was in the prayer of Moshe Rabbeinu, reflective so much on our everyday prayers, praying for individuals, ourselves and families, praying for Am Yisrael and all the berachot that we have, reflective of praying prayers for our nation and the future redemption. And of course, prayers for HaKadosh Baruch Hu and the days that he'll be recognized by the entire world as a single God. All of that fit into a small, neat, and yet precious prayer by Moshe Rabbeinu. Shabbat Shalom.